Welcome to the Think Generational Wealth Podcast, episode number 49, and I am your host, Amir Estimo. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this podcast, and I appreciate you spending your time, spending your days doing whatever it is that you're doing. But the fact that you're listening to this podcast, it is so much appreciated, and I appreciate you guys taking the time. I appreciate the downloads that we have, that I see that are increasing week to week. And let me tell you something. Today's episode's topic is perfection the enemy of progress? And the reason I wanted to title this show topic today, this is actually just me just kind of having a revelation, I would say the last couple of days, because of how people, or even us as humans, sometimes we want to be so perfect that it stunts our dreams and goals. So for me, the reason I came up with this topic was I was in a Facebook group, and in this group, this guy posed a question, and the question he posed, he was talking about how it's a credit repair group. He was talking about how he was researching his business for 8 months, and he didn't take action because he was trying to be perfect, because he wanted everything to be perfect. And it hit me, and I was like, you know what? I've done the same thing. And how many other people has done the same thing, where you overcomplicate something by researching it so much instead of just taking action? And I felt like when he posed this question, it was like more of a self-reflection for me, because the fact that I have done things like that, and you've probably done the same thing too. You have probably done the same thing too, where you have let perfection stunt you from making progress. And when you actually make progress and you take action, then you realize, oh my, I was trying to do all this thing and it was not really well needed. If who's new listening to the podcast, my name is Amir Estimo. I am the host of the Think Generational Wealth Podcast, and this is episode again 49. So please help a brother out. If you enjoy the content, subscribe to the podcast, as my goal is to drop a podcast every Wednesday, 5 o'clock Central. And the goal of this podcast is to build a community of like-minded individuals who are all into expose financial literacy, build generational wealth, so we can pass down to the next generation. And yes, I am talking to people just like me, that looks like me, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't even have to be about that. The fact that whatever you can take out any episode on this podcast, when I release it, I'm doing the same thing you're doing. Is I am doing certain things as far as learning and applying. And my goal too is to help people in general, help them build generational wealth. Because that is the only way we are going to progress as a nation, as a family. Okay. But anywho, going back to the show topic, is perfection is the enemy of progress. And again, as I was saying, when I was in this Facebook group, before I forget to, please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcast. Now, if you get your podcast on Apple, there's a purple app on there and it says podcast. You can search for Think Generational Wealth, and leave a review on the podcast. So this podcast could be this podcast could be grown obviously in the podcast charts, but also a situation of we getting this information out, building generational wealth. So currently for me is I've been in corporate America probably 15 years of my life. And the reason I'm going here is because when I had to make a decision and I left corporate America, I was working in a company and I was in retail management for 10 years. I actually moved up in this company. I was a manager in there 5 years and I learned a lot. And when you young and you get that type of responsibility and leadership, there's so much that you have to learning how to deal with people, different age range, different background. I mean, you really had to find yourself a leadership style that actually fits, that people can appreciate. And the one thing I always realize with people is honesty. You got to be honest with people. And if you're not honest with people, especially being in a position of leadership, it's not going to be easy. So I had to make that change. And it was a scary situation when I took a year off. And I took a year off from corporate America. And I could tell you the first 2 weeks, it was so weird because I was not getting up going to a 9 to 5. It was so weird. Or when you're in retail, I don't know if anybody who's in retail, then you get calls all sorts of the night, and it's almost like you don't have a life. Now, the first 2 weeks as I moved on from corporate America, and then I went into IT a year later, I had to make a change for myself at that point because I don't know how many people that can relate, is when you get to a certain point in your life, you start to question yourself and say, okay, what's next for me? So I was at that point where what's next for me? Because I wasn't happy. I moved to a new state and it still felt the same thing. I still felt that emptiness. And I worked hard, went in IT, shout out to a school named Calaberry in Dallas, Texas. So if you're in Dallas, Texas and listening to this, I highly recommend Calaberry School of Data Analytics. But anywho, they were able to help me out. I learned a lot from them, learned IT, accelerated course, got my next role. And let me tell you something, it still feels that emptiness. So you asked, I was giving you a backstory about me. But what I'm saying is, when I think of this show topic, it brings me to entrepreneurship. Because I feel this is probably the next step for my life, is to get into full-time entrepreneurship. And let me tell you, it is not easy. So just to give you guys a little bit, I've taken a land investing course because I believe there's only so much land that's out in the world, but land is a great opportunity to pass down to the next generational. And let me tell you, this entrepreneurship thing is, you really have to have tough skin. That's what I learned so far. And people just want to talk. And what I realize is what I've been doing so far is sending out blind offers, just to give a little insight what's going on. But send out blind offers, and obviously you get people that call, they're upset. Some are just curious, hey, how'd you get this information? All this stuff going on. But then you run into some people, like I ran into a lady and she didn't like the offer. But one thing she said that stood to me was, she says, I would never sell my land because this is for my children and children's children. You cannot get upset about that. Obviously, it's her property and she has the right to sell it or not. But the fact that she acknowledged that, hey, this needs to be passed down from generation to generation. And let me tell you guys this, anybody who's listening to this podcast, land is a great opportunity because you never know what can happen. If you own that land, and let's say you have Amazon comes and build on that land, you have set the generations to generations and generations and generations because of the residual income. Amazon will be paying you to use your land, because that's the same thing the government does to us. When you buy a house, even if you pay the house off, you still have taxes, property taxes to pay, because of the fact the house that you use, that house was built on the land. The government is doing it. We should be doing it too. And that is why, and let me tell you, I didn't go into retail. I mean, not retail, I'm sorry. I didn't go into residential. Number one, I think it's oversaturated. And number two, and not to say land is not either, there's probably a lot of competition out there. But at the end of the day, you're going to go through, one thing I realized I had to tell myself is I am going to have to go through a lot of no's to get to that yes. And that yes can set off the generations that are going to come behind me. I just probably changed the family tree. So like I said, I'm going to keep you guys updated on my progress. So far, I can be honest with you, I had 3 calls today. I missed 2 of them. That's something I've noted. And I've had one conversation today, and that was interesting. Just the person was talking for like 20 minutes. And the fact that the price that I sent them, they didn't like the price. But here's the key. For me is, I think for me, like especially anybody who's listening to this podcast today, and even think about it, I have almost lived, I'm probably almost dating myself here, but I've almost lived 4 decades. That's interesting. You know, being born in the 80s, and then where you went through the crack epidemic, and we are just as a country still trying to get through the fact that when you think about it, if you're born in the 80s, let's say if you're born in the 1980s, civil rights was 1964, 1963, somewhere around there. That's only 16 years. That is not a long time. So as a country, we're trying to recover from that. Men getting rights, women, I mean, it's not men, but black people getting rights, and women getting rights, that we didn't have this before. And then you get into the 80s and the crack epidemic, and then the 90s, and then obviously the thousands and the tens now. And now we're in the 20s. So you live 4 decades when you think about it. So the whole key here is I had to realize one thing is I cannot let perfection be my enemy when it comes to progress. And even just starting this new adventure, I realize is, one, you're going to have a thick skin. And number 2, you're going to realize people are going to want to talk. And you sometimes just got to let people talk. You got to let people express themselves. Because even this time we're living in right now, how many people just doesn't have someone to talk to? The mental aspect, the mental health is real. That's why, for me, I'm not even affiliated with them. But the fact anybody that get a chance for your mental health, I recommend the Calm app. The Calm app has really helped me. And let me tell you, it's not perfect. And there's times when I meditate, you get all this chatter still in your head. But it takes time, and even I've been at it for over a year. And honestly, it's still a struggle at times. It's still a struggle because it takes a special someone to be able to have to control your mind. And I think about that, and I say that when I realized I wanted to leave corporate America the first time and then went back a year later, what I realized is I should have the same zeal when it comes to entrepreneurship, because it's not easy. That's one thing I've realized so far. Entrepreneurship is not easy. And you cannot let perfection be be the enemy of progress. Do not let perfection be the enemy of progress. And I'll tell you another thing is I have been I when I was in college, one thing I realized in college was I hated talking in front of people. I took a course, public speaking, and we were in a room probably no more than 20 people, and every week we had to give a speech. And one thing was I hated talking in front of people. My heart would race, pounding. And when I became a manager, I realized that was something I had to work on. Because I remember when I would be having when I'd be having team meetings, and sometimes I used to get so nervous that people could barely hear me. But I realized I hated public speaking. So fast forward now in my current occupation, job, I have taken a course. We have a place. I don't know if anybody ever heard. It's called Toastmasters, and where it helps you with speaking. So today, I've probably already given 3 shout outs here. Calaberry School of Data Analytics, the Calm app, and now Toastmasters International. So anybody, if you want to work on your public speaking, and this is what I'm saying, is even Toastmasters, before we were even being in a crowd of, let's say, 8 or 9 people, the anxiety of it was so crazy. I get heavy anxiety, but what I've learned is the more you start doing, and the reason I went back into Toastmasters, because again, fast forward when I left my first job and went into now IT, and for a period of time, I have not talked in front of people. So then I realized okay, I gotta get back into this. I gotta get back because this is something I would start sweating and stuff like that, talking in front of people. And I felt like I was losing that confidence. So then I went into Toastmasters, and now we're virtual. That's helped me. And this is what has even inspired me. That's why I said, when it comes to, do not let perfection be the enemy of progress. Because I just started a podcast, and let me tell you, I can't measure myself to someone else who's probably has 6,000 downloads a week. Don't fall into that trap. Don't fall into the trap of perfection. So if you want to start a podcast, you want to start a business, you want to, whatever dream and aspiration you have, do it. And that's what I've learned, is just, you got to do it. Starting this podcast, people are like, well, what am I going to talk about? Find something you're interested to talk about. And someone is going to listen. Someone will listen. Don't be nervous. Just be yourself. And even for me, I know I don't like, I in real life, I don't curse a lot. I don't curse at all, to be honest with you. It's very rare that I curse. Because, I mean, if somebody does, no offense, to each his own. But for me, I think the language there's so much, like, even vocabulary, enhancing your vocabulary helps. Like, I rather learn, definitely, like my wife was always saying, use too many big words. But I realize it's not big words, it's expanding your vocabulary. And that's where I put a lot of my energy in. So be yourself. So that's why I probably listen to any of my content. You probably never heard me really curse. And if you did, hey, I apologize if that offends you. But you probably never heard me curse, is because it's not something that's not who I am. So therefore, that's why I'm saying, when it comes to even starting a podcast, of the information you may have, share it with the world. Share it with the world. It's okay. Whatever it is you want to do it. And I'm telling you this, folks, if you listen to this podcast long enough, and I'm still able to continue podcasting, like I've always said, this podcast is the Journey podcast. And if you are in that same boat of going from corporate America or changing your life into entrepreneurship. We are all in that same boat. This is the Journey Podcast. And I am your host, Amir Estimo. And again, quote of the day. This is something I think I'm going to add to the podcast at every end of the podcast. So if you listen to this podcast, till the end, you'll always hear quote of the day because I love quotes. I think quotes are very motivating. They're very inspiring. They've changed lives. And that's why this quote right here, I'm going to leave you with. I'm going to leave you with this thought. So before I leave, if you want to contact me, you can reach me at Instagram, ThinkGenWealth, or the Amir Estimo. Or you can search me on LinkedIn at Amir Estimo. Also, you can find me on Facebook with Amir Estimo. Then, again, subscribe to the podcast if you enjoy this content. Rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm going to leave you with this thought. Do not let perfection be the enemy of progress. And I repeat that again. Do not let perfection be the enemy of progress. Appreciate you guys. Thank you for taking time to listen to this episode. And we will drop and see you guys next week.